Why do developers still develop games for the Switch 2, even though it's a lot weaker than the other current gen consoles? We need to take a look of how powerful is the Switch 2. If we look at the specification for the Switch 2, it closely resembles the PS4 Pro. But the Switch 2 have another weapon up their sleeves, and that is Nvidia's DLSS. It's still not as powerful as the Xbox Series S, but with DLSS, the Switch 2 could rival the Series S in some ways. I'm not saying games will look the same quality as the Series S, but it can came close because of DLSS. Nintendo worked closely with Nvidia to make a GPU for the portable hybrid console that is fully compatible with Nvidia's DLSS, and Nvidia even made a specific model for the system that developers can utilize. The Switch 2 have two modes of DLSS, the normal DLSS we see in many games on PC, and the Switch 2 only DLSS, or Digital Foundry like to call Tiny DLSS. Tiny DLSS is a way cheaper DLSS model that helps the cost of latency we see on normal DLSS to half, so you get the benefit of DLSS without sacrificing a lot of latency. But this DLSS model has a problem in the first few games it shipped with. It has a better result in stills, but it breaks instantly in motion. One notable game that uses this type of DLSS is Hogwarts Legacy. The game aims for a 1440p resolution with the help of Tiny DLSS, but the game looks very pixelated in motion because this form of DLSS did little to no anti-aliasing in motion, showing off the raw pixels of the low internal resolution. I even argue the game on PS4 running at 900p looks better because it looks more consistent with simple TAA. This is the worst version of DLSS, but it is still DLSS, which means it can be updated in the future. Because a few months later, Ubisoft released Star Wars Outlaws on the Switch 2, and the game seemingly using the same tiny DLSS used in Hogwarts Legacy, but the result is way more consistent. Even though the image still breaks in motion, but it is more anti-aliased, making a way better image overall than Hogwarts Legacy. And a few days ago, Square Enix released Final Fantasy VII Remake on the Switch 2 using the tiny DLSS model, with no notable image breakup in motion. It still struggles with hair, but overall it's a huge improvement to the prior games released with this form of DLSS. It shows that Tiny DLSS model will keep getting better over time. Realistically, even with DLSS, the Switch 2 is still very underpowered compared to other current gen consoles. But why do third-party developers are in full support for the Switch 2? Games like Resident Evil Requiem, Indiana Jones, 007, and etc. will soon be coming to the Switch 2. The simple answer will be money because of how the console is being sold all over the world, but there is another reason in my opinion why is it more realistic to port or releasing current gen games to the Switch 2. And that's because of the introduction of the enhanced consoles like the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Let alone the Xbox One X, the PS4 Pro is still powerful enough in 2026. That's why we still see games released for PS4 purely because of how well it runs at the PS4 Pro. For example, Resident Evil 4 Remake on PS4 runs at an inconsistent 30 to 45 FPS while the PS4 Pro runs at a solid 60 FPS. There are drops but never hit to the high 40s, same how they perform like the Series X. And also Black Ops 7 runs at a solid 60 FPS at PS4 Pro. But since it's still a PS4 console, developers need to scale their games to run in the standard PS4, same with Xbox One. Because the standard Xbox One is by far the weakest console of that generation, and it is too weak to run these newer games. That's why developers can't release their games at Xbox One even though the Xbox One X is still very powerful in 2026. The enhanced console like the PS4 Pro is not ready yet to be unsupported for future games. But because of the circumstance that it needs to be playable on the standard PS4, developers have no choice to leave the system entirely. And that's where the Switch 2 comes in. The Switch 2 will replace the weird position of the enhanced consoles. Because the Switch 2 is its own console and doesn't have a weaker version of it, developers don't need to scale their games further and focus on one system. And with DLSS, it is more possible for developers to release their games in the system the same time as the other current gen consoles. And that's my reason why developers till this day still developing games for the Switch 2, even though it has their shortcomings of it being the least powerful console of the generation.